welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Welcome, everyone, to the At Peace Parents podcast. I am here with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alex Klein, a clinical psychologist who works with PDA children, teens, and families, among other forms of neurodivergence. He is in San Francisco, and today he's joining me to talk about some questions that are top of mind for a lot of parents having to do with therapy, autism evaluations, and also as parents, how we decide whether or not to get evaluated ourselves for neurodivergence. So welcome, Alex. It is so good to be with you again.
It's so good to see you, Casey. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, it's awesome. All right, my friends. So why don't we start with the first question that I think both of us get asked a lot. And it is, should I, as a parent, get assessed?
Yeah, such a good question, because so many parents maybe they've sort of post getting their child diagnosed are starting to see some of these overlapping traits in themselves. Maybe they have before that, and maybe they haven't, but a pretty common dynamic I see is where, I might assess a child and the parent starts to become more and more curious, like, I can really relate to a lot of this stuff. Like, I feel like I'm seeing a lot of this in myself. And of course, there can be many differences, right? It's not always going to be the same diagnoses, but yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think some of the main things that come to mind for me in thinking about this is, one is sort of like a practical thing, which is like, especially when there's so much time and energy and resources maybe spent on one's child, does the parent have both the financial capacity to handle, to get an assessment themselves, right? Is this going to be covered by insurance or not? Or what kind of coverage are they going to get? But also the mental capacity of sort of like, am I going to go through a process that, hopefully ultimately would be good and helpful, but can also be heavy and time consuming to some extent, right? So, what is, the parent's capacity to kind of go through a process like that? I mean, that's sort of an initial thing that comes to mind for sure, because a lot of the parents I see in the PDA space for sure are, they might be pretty burned out themselves. They may have had lots of interactions with providers in regards to their children, where maybe they felt like kind of judged or shamed or blamed for issues going on. It can almost lead to, I call it like a provider PTSD almost, where it's almost like one's trust of providers is sort of been damaged, sadly. And so even when it comes to seeking a provider themselves, that's still in the mix here, right? Even if it's not in regard to their child, it can still be in the mix, right? Like, is this person also going to think that this is ridiculous, the same way I got, a response when I said, I think my child's PDA, and maybe that was dismissed. Are they going to dismiss me as being part of some kind of overdiagnosis trend or something like that? Like, a lot of parents come in, for the adult evaluations, I see having fears like this, which I think is sadly common. And
do adult evaluations? I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely. I think I used to do a majority child evaluations, and now it's probably half and half. I'd say I probably do like half. I even assess some grandparents too. So, it's sort of, like across the lifespan now. I think in the same week, I assessed a 5-year-old and a 75-year-old one time, which I thought was really cool.
Were they from the same family?
No, but genetics is a thing, right? We do see these traits, going down the family line. I've been sort of toying with the idea of piloting like family-based assessments, where we're sort of like looking at the different generations, which has been super interesting. Yeah, to be thinking about that for sure. But Yeah, so I do think about like, well, what is a parent or any adult sort of capacity to navigate the system for them, themselves when they're already been burned out and exhausted. I think that, one of the things that is talked about some is the idea of like, well, maybe I should just self-diagnose. And I think that that really is valid and should not be dismissed. I know some, psychologists in my world might, that might be like a blasphemous statement or something like, but
Here for
we
it.
know that, right? But we know that like it can be totally inaccessible to people. It can be unaffordable. Again, maybe they've been dismissed when they've gone to their doctor to request this referral. All kinds of reasons why somebody might want to lean on self-diagnosis. And so, I'm definitely not dismissive of that. That said, I mean, there are reasons to have really genuine curiosity. Some people are kind of uncertain, like maybe I fit, the diagnostic criteria for this or that. Maybe I don't, and there are a lot of things like if we could take an example of a symptom like avoidance of social outings or something like many different you talk about root cause a lot, right? Like
Yeah.
so the root cause of something like that, there could be many different things
Yeah, yeah.
that could lead to that, right? So is this like about sensory overwhelm that we don't want to be in these social situations, or is it a mistrust of others stemming from trauma and one's upbringing, for example? Or is this a rejection sensitivity that's common in ADHD, a fear of being rejected? Or is this like a highly sensitive person who just feels everything so deeply and being in this party atmosphere might just be like too much? Or is it a demand to kind of feel like you have to perform or respond? And or is this a low capacity related to depression? Or is this social anxiety? Is this anxiety coming from a medical issue, even like an overactive thyroid or something? Like there could be so many
Yeah.
different reasons why, somebody might have a certain, symptom or challenge, right? And so sometimes sorting that out with a provider to try to think about like all the different things that could go into having trouble in a social setting. And often it's multiple things. So these are
Yeah.
just some of the initial thoughts I have that come up
Yeah.
there.
No, I love that. I love the root cause exploration. The thing that popped into my head is like maybe the person just doesn't like the people who are going to be at the party, because like
Yeah, totally.
I
Yeah.
think that determines my capacity a lot is like who's on the other end of the social engagement, right?
Right.
How safe are the people?
Right. Exactly.
So I want to circle back to one of the things that you said, because I think it's such an interesting point. I see it in my work with parents as well, which is, these aha moments when the parent is going through this, diagnostic process with their kids, when they say or feel something like, well, I was just like that as a kid. So are there patterns or trends that you see that, especially with PDA families, where it's like an aha moment of like, oh, this isn't just about demand avoidance? Because often parents are like, well, I have a job, I have a career, I'm married, like I didn't avoid my whole life. I go out and do things. But then when they start to get a deeper understanding beyond just demand avoidance, which I think, you and I work in that nuance, they're like, oh yeah, like I had that internal or lived experience. So do you see like certain things that light up a parent's eyes in recognition?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, sometimes when people say, like, oh, well, I was just like that. So sometimes I hear that in different contexts, right? So one context I might hear that is like, oh, well, I was just like that. And I was able to push through, and therefore I'm going to try and make my child push through.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a little bit of a dangerous sort of framing in the sense that, like, well, one, yes, of course, we do see very genuine and real similarities and overlapping traits, right? But then there could, of course, still be differences between, us and our kids. So are we sort of seeing the kid as sort of the same as us or an extension of ourselves versus like seeing a kid as being, nuanced in their own right? So that is sort of something that can be a little bit tricky to sort of sort out. Is that what kind of you're getting at, Casey, when you said like, oh, I see similarities, or was it something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see that mostly
Mm-hmm.
with dads. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
gonna
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
talk to the pattern that I see, which is like usually the mom is the one who's leading the charge with caregiving and
Right.
the diagnostic process. And, you know, when I see that resistant pattern of like, well, I had some of this too, but I just did the thing, then it can be
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I can't just let my kid, you know, have all these accommodations and lower demands or maybe homeschool for a period of
Mm-hmm.
time because I never got that and I'm successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I get
Mm-hmm.
that. And I actually have had thoughts like that too as a
Mm.
mom, like earlier on in my journey. Well, I just did the thing. Like I just pushed through
Mm-hmm.
if I was anxious or whatever. But the question I was sort of thinking about in terms of my work, when I see the aha moment, it's when we're talking about nervous system mechanisms. So it's like maybe there's a mom who has been very successful in her life and she, you know, she's married, she has friends, she's like has a good job or had a career and she has this very defiant or oppositional child who's aggressive and she's like I'm nothing like that, right? But then we talk about like your child is having a fight flight response. That's what their nervous system's doing. But hey, guess what? There's also freeze fawn. And
Right.
that's also a nervous system response. And if both of you are having a nervous system response from the same root cause of perceiving being below someone or perceiving not having autonomy, then the parent can make this link, this aha moment of like, oh, the kid's actually not the opposite of me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. I
I'm
see
kind of
exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
wondering about,
Yeah. And I love how, that making that link can be really important. I think that sometimes parents feel there can be a lot of like internalized stigma or internalized ableism, like I should just sort of push through this, or, I don't really deserve accommodations, or, there's something wrong with me. Like I sometimes, we kind of peel away the layers for people. Like sadly, I do see these elements there in many neurodivergent folks. I do think that one of the advantages of an assessment might be like sort of assuming we're landing on a diagnosis, like putting a name on things, I think can kind of help people feel like, actually, I can take myself more seriously here. It's like I can
yeah,
take more steps to protect my nervous system, because I don't need to go into freeze or fawn states here. So I think sometimes putting a name on it does help us to kind of protect ourselves a little bit more in a way that's important.
yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think this question, you know, when parents ask me shoulds, I always say there are no shoulds,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's only your decisions and what brings you the most amount of peace overall. So, one thing that I have found has been helpful, and you already mentioned it, is to separate the diagnostic process from like your lived experience and how you identify, and those don't have to be the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you might need to go through a diagnostic process because maybe you need accommodations at work and you need like a
Right.
formal diagnosis, or
Totally.
there's, you know, imposter syndrome and you would feel like it's easier to advocate for yourself with your friends and family or beyond with that diagnosis in hand. And then for other families, it's more getting the permission to, you know, own the lived experience and also give permission not to spend the money and go through the process.
Right. Right.
And I think,
Totally.
as you said, like both are valid,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. And, you know, I see a lot of parents of all different neurotypes, including neurotypical. So it's not always PDA kid, PDA adult, right? Like it's,
Right.
we often have PDA kid, ADHD adult, or PDA kid,
Mm-hmm.
non PDA autistic adult, or a combo, you know,
Mm-hmm.
ADHD. So I think the root cause conversation is super helpful as
Mm-hmm.
well. If you throw in perimenopause and the state of the world, it can get really
Yeah.
confusing what's causing our nervous systems to like
100%. Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, I think that, like, in general, I think that the process of getting an assessment and, landing on a diagnosis, which often, not always, but often, that's where we land. I do think it tends to kind of help people make more sense of one's life. It can be kind of painful and hard in a way. There can be a sort of some loss and grieving in it, with like, well, I wish this had been understood more growing up. I wish I'd understood this myself. I wish my parents or the school system had understood this better. Really, and I think that it can be sort of painful, but that can also be mixed in with a sense of relief, right? As you said, not feeling like an imposter, not feeling like, okay, now I have more self-compassion. I can allow myself to make these accommodations for myself in a way that maybe I felt a little bit weird about before. It didn't feel that comfortable, or like I could really own that. So, I do think that there's a lot of parents I see who I might ultimately assess who, they're working so hard to, everything to sort of be okay and to get through, right? Or feeling like they're sort of faking it, masking, right? But we also know that, masking can lead to burnout and anxiety and depression, right? And so maybe, again, going through this process could help somebody unmask in a way that feels right to them, in a way that brings a little bit more well-being. So, I have seen that process play out like that before, for sure.
Yeah. So as I've been exploring my own neurodivergence, I did some discovery calls with clinicians about the process of getting evaluated as an adult for autism.
Mm-hmm.
And it involved conversations, paperwork, some testing, and then also interviews with other people in the parent's life. But I didn't actually go through the process. So can you just walk us through, if a parent is listening and they're thinking you know what, I want to do this. Can you give them a sense of what it would be like to go through the evaluation process with you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because some assessments are more focused on an autism spectrum and ADHD question, for example. And then some are a full neuropsych battery of testing where one would be getting IQ testing and just more detailed testing to look at one's cognitive strengths and challenges. And sometimes, for example, if there's a referral question am I dyslexic, let's say, and I'm wondering if I'm a dyslexic, I'm wondering if I'm autistic, PDA, I'm wondering if I have ADHD. Sometimes some questions do actually require kind of more of a battery than others. Sometimes there's but in a more kind of autism, ADHD focused evaluation, I'd say that often, not always, this can be done in a bit more of a focused way. And I do think that, asking providers, right? If we're thinking about how do we sort of screen providers, right? Because I like that, you mentioned doing the intro call or the discovery calls, really important. If a provider does, if you ask for that and they don't do that, that would be kind of a red flag to me, honestly.
Yeah.
I do think that asking if the assessor has experience with high masking people, or if you're a woman, do they have experience with high masking women, and assessing that, that might be really important, right? Because we know that sometimes ADHD, autism spectrum stuff might be more likely to be missed with that population. I think sometimes, if the assessor is neurodivergent themselves, that can be a real plus, right? How much do they sort of value lived experience through clinical interviewing, or are they sort of focusing on more kind of objective data, through something like the ADOS, which is a common tool that can be used for both kids and adults, a little bit more commonly used for kids. I tend to think that most assessments should involve, a lot of clinical interviewing to really understand someone's lived experience. I think that using self-report questionnaires can be really good. How do they see themselves in terms of ADHD symptoms or autism spectrum symptoms, and looking at that. You mentioned asking other family members, right? So this is something that I do think can be quite
at work.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
my
boss at work would have been she was the most neurotypical, compliant leader, because I was so focused on achieving, but what was driving it was my anxiety was keeping my like quirkiness in check most of the
Totally.
time, right?
Hmm.
Because of
Hmm.
the desire to perform in the workplace. And I loved the work, but it was like,
Hmm.
my academic drive. I think the degree to which I've experienced anxiety is directly proportionate to how neurotypical I appear. Okay, so the
Right.
more anxious I am, the more I'm going to appear completely neurotypical. And the
Yeah.
more relaxed I am, the more it's like,
Yeah.
the real me comes out. But that's not even, but there have been years of my life where my anxiety was so high, I never would have even considered myself
Right.
neurodivergent because it was almost like I was self-policing without even realizing it.
Totally. And that is a good example of why I would say requiring sort of your boss or your own parents, even if you're a parent themselves, or somebody else to fill out questionnaires. I would say to me that it can be a problem because your boss or your own parents or whoever there might be a lot they don't know about your internal experience, right? So while it can be useful to have your spouse or a sibling or a close friend or a boss fill out some questionnaires, and some people do feel comfortable with that. I'd say that like we don't want to think of that as an absolute necessity because again, masking is a thing, right? So
Yeah.
like so that can be an issue, right? If we're like, well, we can only get to a diagnosis if we talk to these other people, like that would be concerning to me. That said, it can be really useful if we can find trusting people to
Yeah.
to fill out some of the those questionnaires or to have conversations with them as part of the assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think it would come out if my spouse or my close friends were interviewed for sure.
Right.
This is probably a kind of like a little off topic and maybe a little controversial, but I just want to talk about it because I think it got in the way of me exploring my own neurodivergence,
Mm-hmm.
which is the breadth of the autism spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
which people feel very strongly about on both sides, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
like a non speaking child who uses assistive technology would have had nothing in common with my experience as a child, even if I identify as autistic. And so, I think it's been, for me, what's disabled me at points in my life is my panic disorder, which I think is another name for my neurodivergence. Like I was diagnosed with panic disorder and I've gone through not lots, 3 big burnout periods that were disabling to me. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of my social communication, restricted and repetitive interests, and even my sensory experience prior to trauma healing was not disabling to me. And in fact, I think some of my autistic traits were strengths that I was rewarded for, like hyper
Mm-hmm.
focus, pattern recognition. You know, I think in some ways I was hyposensitive where I could completely tune out everything else and just focus on academics in a way that was kind of uncanny. And like photographic memory as a child. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as I've been exploring this for myself, like, am I an autistic woman? I do feel like it's a very different life experience than what my children are experiencing with the
Mm-hmm.
burnouts in PDA and also more disabled autistic children, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think sometimes I find it hard to wrap my mind around that,
Mm-hmm.
even though I do think I have a distinct experience than a neurotypical that
Right.
and in the social media space and beyond and reading books by autistic women, I'm like, wow, that's exactly my experience. Am I autistic? But
Mm-hmm.
it's so different from some of the other places on the spectrum that
Right.
are more highlighted in medical spaces.
Right.
And so that's just something I've been grappling with because it is different. Like I did
Yeah.
not struggle as a child in the same way that my own kids are struggling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can see how, right, this kind of thing can get a little bit polarized, right? Maybe more online, we see sort of, a little bit of, conflict in some of these areas. Like, should we be including, everyone under, the autism spectrum umbrella or not? I'd say that like that's pretty common, I think, for some people to have, some challenges, maybe kind of owning a diagnosis or sort of feeling like I truly and do belong in this community because there are differences between myself and somebody else. I'd say that's just extremely common in terms of what I come across, right? That said, right, I think, for some people, it can still be really helpful to be like, okay, yes, there are differences between myself and maybe some other autistic people who might have a different experience, have higher support needs, but yet, my needs are still valid. Like I still need to find ways to protect my nervous system. I still
I
need,
still need my
and so
weighted blanket and my two noise machines and my
exactly.
bag over my face.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. Hmm.
Yeah, no, I find that with some of the women that I work with, it's like, often they're successful and have higher
Hmm.
education and all the things. And so it's like hard for them also to compare themselves when their child is in such intense burnout and truly disabled from. I mean, also there is a difference between autistic burnout, I think, and PDA burnout.
Right. Right.
Okay, so you mentioned looking for getting an autism evaluation either for a parent or for a child. So you mentioned, do they have experience with high masking or women? So that would apply to parents. Are they neurodivergent themselves? Are there other things that parents either thinking about an evaluation for themselves? Oh, you said discovery call.
Yes.
Okay. Are there other things that parents who are looking for an evaluation for themselves should be like queuing into?
I mean, I think we hit the main ones. I mean, this other thing I would add is vibes really matter,
Yeah, they
right?
do. They do.
And like
Vibes.
am I going to be able to, like really kind of let this person in about what my experience is like? Do I feel like they're going to be non-judgmental? Again, I mentioned the provider PTSD thing where I think can be very real of like, it can be hard to enter into the space. It's really vulnerable. So, and it can be hard to get a true sense of that from a 15 to 20-minute intro call, but also not impossible. Like there are sort of, vibes that I think people do get, right? From people pretty early on after not that much interaction. So, and I think kind of sometimes asking some tough questions like, how would you handle it if I'm not comfortable with my own parents? Filling out these questionnaires because I think that my parents are going to be dismissive of this and they have
Mm.
their own stereotypes about what the autism spectrum looks like. So how do you think about that? What kind of tools do you use to kind of make a determination about this? All of that stuff can be really important to check
Yeah.
into.
Okay, here's another question.
Sure.
And I think this applies for kids too. So often when we want to get therapy for our kids, for our PDA kids, or we want to get them evaluated in a way that will serve them, parents often have to go outside of what's covered by insurance. Not always, but like when you describe the way that you evaluate parents, like clinical interviewing as a method, are there guardrails or like gates around what you have to do if you are getting this covered by insurance versus wanting it to be more tailored and neurodiversity affirming? Like, do you take insurance? And B, are there times when you can't take insurance because of the way that you're doing the evaluation? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, for many years I took insurance directly and worked at Kaiser Permanente, but now there's a lot of variability. Some people can get some out of network coverage. So, the codes one would use like myself as doing an assessment, are not going to vary based on how neuroaffirming the assessment is or isn't. There's sort of like basic, like these are sort of codes we use for assessment. And there does have to be some kind of diagnosis, whether, it's the one you're assessing for directly or not. So I would say like whether one gets some reimbursement does not dictate what kind of assessment one would have to do. But there's, of course, then all this variability in one's, in whatever insurance people have, whether they can get, a chunk reimbursed or not, or how much of a chunk.
Yeah. So would they have to get a referral from like a primary care physician?
Well, sometimes, so typically if that is one way to do it, and that is, people can self-refer all the time, and people can and do. But yeah, another source of referrals might be to, ask your PCP. But some people might not be comfortable asking their primary care providers, right? Because again, there might be a fear of like this is going to get dismissed, or are they going to have just some stereotype about what ADHD or autism, PDA or something. And so, I think that's why some people are self-referring. I think that for, to try to get someone that's in network for your insurance, like that's different. Like typically that could come from a referral from your regular doctor, but even that, you can still sort of seek out those people individually, and insurance providers are supposed to have lists of people. It's limited. It can be hard to find people because there's just not enough people doing this. It is improving over time though, I would say.
Okay, cool. Now, what if we're looking to get our kids evaluated for PDA and or autism? What advice do we have?
Yeah, there are lists. I know, you have lists of providers on your website, Casey, and PDA North America has lists of providers that are sort of have gone through some of the training in PDA. The list is divided up by state, and so you can find different providers in different states and people who've gone through training. I do think that, it can be important to know, like, to in your sort of initial questions of the clinician, like, what's your experience with PDA? Have you assessed, kids of all ages? How do you think about, sort of parent report versus sort of individual interaction with the child? And what I'm getting at there is that there are some kids that in the context of a one-on-one interaction with an adult, you might not see certain things, right? And so is this a provider that's really going to believe you and the challenges you see, right? Because again, like, a teacher might not see ADHD symptoms or autism or PDA symptoms because the kid is masking. And so I think asking providers like how they think about that, if that's the case with your kid. So, and if they were to say like, oh, well, like if we don't see, if I don't hear, X, Y, and Z at school, then like we're not going to land on a diagnosis. Like that would be a bit concerning to me because again, like as you said, your employer wouldn't have known anything, like you're right, because just others aren't just necessarily going to see what's going on. So I think with a child, like we are valuing not just child reports, but also the parent reports and really having to value that. So I do think that's a really important thing. And I would I think asking providers, like, how do you adapt your assessment for children children who might be masking, can be hard to see, but also who might kind of resist some of the structured tasks you might want to do. Like, how do they handle that? Like, that is I think can be an important question. So if you are anticipating your child might have a really difficult time, I think asking the provider, like, well, what would they do about that? And how would they think about that? And can they still do the assessment? Or how would they try to go about it in a different way? That can be a really important question too.
Yeah, those are the two sticking points that I think are hard for parents. It's like their kid might mask, which is what my older son did because we were
Right.
with him during the assessment too, like providing support.
Right.
And so for his diagnosis of autism, we had to advocate more versus my younger one who did a neuropsych and we weren't allowed in the room. Like he more clearly was not able to sustain his regulation and masking by the end without us there and got a level 2 diagnosis. But I think for parents, it's like they're often going to mask and they don't appear like anything is atypical, or the parents can't get their kid in the door because it's like avoidance and activation. And yeah, I mean, as a researcher, right? And we've talked about this in like conflict zones of Colombia. South America. We had to see metadata, not just what the person said, but how they said it or didn't say it. So like in conflict zones, like women couldn't talk publicly about sexual violence, right? So like during a questionnaire, you're not going to get a woman answering accurately, but maybe they pull a woman aside later and share something related to that question, right? Or how they respond to it and then talk about it later. So it's like we had to see the data beyond the data.
Right.
So like for an assessment of a PDA kid, I often wish there was this concept of metadata of like, can you see the avoidance and the activation of the nervous system as data, even if they're not able to engage in the questionnaire or the game or the IQ test. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. One thing I also think about is like how, for kids who've got having difficulty being flexible, how do we as providers meet that difficulty being flexible with, are we also having difficulty being flexible in how we conduct the assessment, or are we meeting the kid where they're at? Like, are we willing to do, a community-based visit just to like kind of get to know a kid, right? Or being in the home. I've done that, a dozen or more times where, a kid who couldn't access the office. I think sometimes trying to get buy-in is really important, and easier said than done many times. Sometimes I find that if a child does feel like they're going to get something out of it, like, hey, we want to make sure we're doing a good job, as best a job we can as parents in not, upsetting you, or like we want the school maybe to do a better job about, how much they're pressuring you to do. If that's genuinely true, that can be a way sometimes to create some buy-in. But you're right. I mean, there is all kinds of things that it's like, what can we see in the moment versus what other people reporting? But then again, how can we be flexible with as providers and trying to obtain the information we need, right? Because I do think that sometimes, some assessors are a little bit more like, well, this is like how I do things. Like, this is my battery of tests that I use, and like, this is my thing. So certainly I think thinking outside the box and creatively is going to be really important with some kids, for sure.
Yeah. And I do like, just if there's providers, like if there's another clinical psychologist listening, or developmental pediatrician, or whoever is doing the assessment, I do want to name and validate, like, we understand you're working within a system. And so sometimes that does not allow for creativity or flexibility. However,
absolutely,
let's say this person listening does have some ability to be creative and flexible. You mentioned a home visit or a community visit. Can you maybe give us an anecdote or another tip or two about like times you've been flexible? Like, let me give you an example. I was working with a parent in the program, and she was talking to me about her son, or sharing that her son was unable to attend about 80% of his therapy sessions, but the 20% he did attend were successful. And so sometimes the therapist would come out and either engage a little bit from the car and then count that as a session. And sometimes the mom just had to like drive around and go home. But the therapist kept the client despite the fact that he couldn't access consistently. I mean, the parent was still paying for the sessions, right? But it was like sometimes the quote session would be the mom driving around in the parking lot. Sometimes part of the session would be that, and then the provider coming out to like talk through the window. And then sometimes it was a typical therapy session sitting in the therapy room and processing feelings and it going well. So when I heard that anecdote, it's like, okay, there are like, we can meet people halfway if we're creative and have the right intent. So I'm wondering if you have any assessment or evaluation anecdotes.
Yeah, I mean, I've done stuff along those lines, first of all, for sure, like very similar scenarios. I'd say like, another example might be, like what is this kid most interested in? And like, let's just start with that, right? Like you're really into Legos. Can you show me your coolest Lego piece? Can you really into Minecraft? Like, let's get on, like play Minecraft together to start. Or like, just how can we kind of meet kids where they're at and kind of slowly build the relationship from there? That, again, might be the only way to kind of develop the connection, right? Because otherwise, if we're kind of going into it with our own agenda, that's going to be, that kind of demand or pressure might be met with a lot of resistance, right? So that's just not going to work. And I could see how someone might say like, okay, well, like I can't see this kid. And, and there are some people, and I've had periods like this too, where like I can't travel to and from somewhere else in between sessions or something, right? Like there are practical considerations or people working in clinics. Like I get all that, but still, like what is a way we can meet the kid where they're at, starting with their interests and passions? I mean, typically would be the best chance we have at a starting point, but then also seeing if we can create some buy-in because maybe the kid can get something out of it too, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of flows right into the third question we were going to discuss, which is finding the right providers for services. So, maybe we've had our assessment, we got an autism diagnosis, and I should say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, the diagnosis in the United States is going to be ASD. It's not going to be PDA because it doesn't exist yet here.
Yeah, I mean, I describe it in my report. I mean, I'm saying like, if a kid meets criteria for autism or not, if I see it as PDA profile, like I'm describing that, I'm writing about it. But yeah, it's not like the listed official diagnosis, not the code to get reimbursement, right?
Yeah. Okay, this brought up another question. Have you ever given an ADHD diagnosis and then written in the description with PDA traits?
Yes, although I will say that is more uncommon in my experience, right? I mean, I think the question that links to is like, is a PDA profile always part of the autism spectrum? Which is sort of a harder question. I feel like we just need more research and, discussions around that one. I would say that like most of the kids I see who do really, where the PDA profile really, really fits and resonates the most, like are also, maybe it's harder to see, but are also meeting criteria for autism. It's just maybe, again, this is going to be much different from the stereotype about what maybe many people see as being what being autistic is like. So, but yes, I think I can count on two hands the amount of times where, right, there's an ADHD, maybe other diagnoses as well, but I really felt like a PDA profile also fit, and I was writing about that. I personally believe that like a lot of these strategies that are utilized in, like that PDA informed practitioners are recommending are just kind of good strategies in general. So, so sometimes like whether we are having like a autism spectrum diagnosis with a full-blown PDA profile or not, like sometimes there's going to be similarities. Yes, there's differences, but there's also overlapping kind of recommendations, right? So like principles of collaborative problem solving, for example, or understanding the why, or being flexible and finding ways to get at the just right challenge for kids, right? Like understanding when to lower demands. Like these are important principles for all kinds of neurodivergent folks, right? And so I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because it does matter. And I think, label and framing does matter, but, sometimes recommendations are going to kind of overlap either way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay. So I know that you have a background also in DIR floor time, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is a play-based therapy. Well, it's developmental,
individual difference, relationship-based approach. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we give an overview from each of our perspectives of what types of therapy we have seen support PDA kids when they have an ability to access it, because sometimes therapy is not accessible when a child is deep in burnout.
Right.
So I want to name that. But let's say, especially with PDA kids who are motivated by dopamine, novelty, being out there, having a relationship with other kids or with a provider, or they're coming out of burnout and have things they do want to work on or goals that they have and that therapy could facilitate. What are the types of therapeutic modalities you have seen support PDA kids and maybe even teens and adults, and are they different?
Yeah, sometimes I find this is such a good question that can be hard for me to answer in the abstract because speaking of individual differences and DAR, like in any given case, I do feel like there's just enough nuance that it is hard, I think, to answer that in like a broad way of like, these are the best things to do. I would say that.
Or what should parents look up? What should parents like? Because, like, let's say I'm a parent and I am totally new to all this stuff, neurodiversity, autism, everything.
Yeah,
And, when I started my journey, I didn't know what occupational therapy was. I didn't know
yeah,
what a speech language pathologist was, what DIR floor time was, what ABA was. Like, I just had no idea.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
what are things like, if let's say you and I, like, you just gave me a diagnosis for my kid, I'm brand new to this, and my
Yeah,
kid's not fully in burnout. And I
right.
know I'm inside your head because you're probably thinking, well, do they need like gross motor planning? Let's go to an OT.
Right, right, right.
But what are some things that parents can look into?
Yeah, I mean, I think occupational therapists, not everyone realizes that they also can be very important if regulation is a challenge, right? Self-regulation, really common, primary challenge. If we were listing out like the most common primary challenges in the clients I see, like that would be listed. Sometimes OTs can play a really important role in helping kids learn self-regulation. I know you've talked a little bit about polyvagal theory. I think there's some really important, very cool stuff going on in that world. I'm a big fan of sort of collaborative problem solving, collaborative and proactive solutions, the CPS model that the psychologist Ross Green talks about. I think that one thing I actually want to, in the DR floor time model, which is sort of, I think, stereotyped a bit to be thought of as used more with younger children, but I think actually those principles of meeting somebody where they're at, like starting with their interest, prioritizing that relationship, taking into account, their sensory differences is something that actually can be applied to anyone, really.
Mm.
But I do want to distinguish, right? So that's like, if we think about two areas, one is like, what are sort of direct services for a child, and then what are kind of interventions that are more geared towards the systems around the child. And so it's not always like an either or thing, right? Like, so, maybe we can do both, right? So maybe there is room to try psychotherapy for, a particular child and working on this, and you can get buy-in. But sometimes I think about like, well, maybe the most supportive thing a family, can do for their child would be to like engage an educational advocate to kind of like help things at school, because what goes on at school, whether the school sees it or not, might be the biggest influencing factor about what kind of challenges are going on at home. And so how do we look at the system around the child to better support the child, right? So like parents having, what I think of as like a co-thinker to think together with another clinician, maybe about how can we best support the child at home? What's the right level of demands? How can we support the child at school? That can be super important to think about. So I think of that as like systems interventions. But yeah, then there's these like sort of individual direct service for the child, right? So like psychotherapy, maybe the OT, sometimes there's a role for medication with a psychiatrist or an NP. Sometimes there's a role for, how do we find social groups? I'm not a huge fan of like social skills groups that are like kind of like what I would say are sort of overly focused on like teaching kids to act in a certain way, right? Like I want to stay away from that way to frame it, but social groups that are based on shared interests, like that can be a really important kind of intervention or something that's like brings about some more well-being for some kids. So yeah, but those are some things that come to mind, right? There's all, different types of therapies. You get speech, you get OT, you got, physical therapy for some kids if they've got low muscle tone. Like, I don't know, there's just all kinds of different things to be considering. I also think about like, what's the capacity of the child and the family to
Yeah.
handle and engage in services like we were talking about before, like some kids that's going to be really tough, right? And so how flexible can the providers be? How do we think about like, well, what's the priority? Maybe right now my kid needs a break from us trying to push push therapy, but maybe I can work on, support at my parenting and how to support them at school differently. So yeah, it's very case by case, I think. But those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah. The families I work with, often their child is struggling to access therapy.
Yeah.
Not always, but,
Yeah.
With my younger son, William, who's 6.5, well, he's turning 7 actually in 2 weeks. He has gone off and on to occupational therapy since he was 1, and he in burnout cannot access any therapy.
Right.
And also, we worked with a psychiatrist with medication stuff, but he was also refusing his medication. So I just want to say that because sometimes that happens for a period of time, and
exactly.
it's okay, right? It's a season of sort of going to ground and focusing on safety first, health safety first. And I still think it's not necessarily a bad thing that, we tried the medication and he refused it, because it's he had that experience. He knows it's there. And we may try again in the future from a different place or not.
Right.
So it's interesting because his older brother really wanted to do both therapy and medication for anxiety, his medication. And I could see a difference with his SSRI within 3 days. And his younger brother, 4 years younger, took the same SSRI and actually was at double the dose of my now almost 11-year-old, and we didn't see any difference. So it's just interesting because be really helpful for some PDA kids and for others not so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and it depends on the medication, obviously. We tried two different ones, but
of course. Yeah, but there's such an array of things. I mean, I think sometimes, when things are hard, parents really understandably, we want to engage the providers, we want to get more services, we want to support, but, that doesn't always look like more hours of therapies. Sometimes that looks like backing off, actually, right? And sometimes that is supporting the overall well-being of their child.
Therapy.
Right, exactly.
Therapy. Yeah, I just to go back to the adult thing. I started therapy when I was diagnosed with panic disorder at the age of 26, New York City, and started my SSRI then because I was I was not okay.
Yeah.
I had lost 20 pounds. I was disassociating. I couldn't sleep, night sweats, all the things. And so I found for a long period of time talk therapy very helpful. But to progress in my healing to where I am now, and actually after reading Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, the last third of the book, it's all the different body-based modalities. I've gone through almost all of them. EMDR, somatic experiencing, trauma-informed massage, I do yoga, internal family systems, and what else? Havening. So EMDR has been amazing. I've done the Safe and Sound protocol for myself a couple times.
Oh, great.
And internal family systems I love.
Yeah, me too.
It's so great. No bad parts,
Yes.
It's
yeah.
so
I have that book on my table somewhere here. Yes.
Yeah. So I think I like all of it. I mean, I'm a big therapy person. And I think for some people who are demand avoidant, the more body-based stuff can be more accessible. I've learned from the work that I do with parents. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I really agree with that. And I love everything you just mentioned. I think are really great interventions. A little bit more likely some of that to be used with adults, but not entirely. Some of that stuff can be used with kids and teens for sure. To come full circle a little bit, right? Sometimes there's usefulness in an assessment because that can, the framing through which we understand challenging behaviors might influence what we want to do about it, right? And so I use that example of avoidance of social situations, right? So if that's purely anxiety driven, right? Maybe we are, as a therapist, like I'm not going to be, encouraging or to kind of push through. Or sorry, if it is anxiety driven, it might be more likely to. Whereas if this is around like sensory overwhelm, it's a
Yeah.
much different way to think about it, right? Like I'm thinking, well, maybe, are there some people that you want to be close with? Maybe there's other smaller group ways to kind of connect with those people, or maybe just going to the party really early or really late when it's not at its peak is going to be a better time for you because there's less sensory overwhelm or something like that. I don't know, just as sort of, or is this sort of is there a trauma related, reason why, we're sort of having difficulty trusting people, for example, right? So then maybe that's more of an EMDR type of approach for trauma. So yeah, I mean, coming full circle, like I do think that sort of there's some utility to kind of understanding, right? Like my own nervous system capacity, my own neurodivergence, how does that sort of intersect with mental health stuff like anxiety? And that can, of course, influence how we deal with it. So people are complicated, which is why it's, again, like hard to kind of have like one answer, to like how we handle stuff, right?
No, totally. I get that. But
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I also think your idea about like family tree assessments and evaluations
Yeah.
is one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard. And I think you
Yeah.
should, like pieer it.
The key is to get buy-in from all the generations, right?
Yeah.
Like we might have one or two, right? But is grandma or grandpa gonna, are they around? Are they gonna do it? Maybe, but maybe not. But yes, it's a work in progress, right? Like how can we find some shared traits here, across the generations here, and how can we talk about that and understand that a little? Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. Well, thank you for your expertise, for sharing your processes and your brilliance. Where can parents find you if they want to be assessed or if they want to join your parent group or any of your offerings?
Sure. And thank you, Casey. So we can, dralexklein.com, DRALEXKLEIN. All of it is right there. But thank you, Casey, for having me on again. I love chatting with you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care, Casey.
Thanks, everyone, for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.